Three nations making a slight but potentially significant change. The US, UK and Australia unveiling a new AUKUS plan to develop weapons systems for underwater drones.
Last month, Japan fired a missile from Philippine soil for the first time since World War II. An American launcher fired a Tomahawk from the Philippines operationally for the first time ever. China called Japan's move the first offensive weapons use by Japanese forces overseas in 80 years. Australia was standing next to both of them, and Beijing noticed. That moment didn't happen by accident. It was the product of a military transformation that Australia has been running at full speed for 4 years, spending money at a scale this country hasn't seen since the Second World War. The country famous for losing a war to emus in 1932, yes, that happened, yes, the emus won, is now the third nation in history to fire a Tomahawk cruise missile, is buying nuclear submarines, and just signed a $7 billion frigate deal with Japan. 425 billion Australian dollars over the next decade. And China is furious about every single piece of it. Here is exactly what Australia has built, what it's still missing, and why this is Beijing's worst regional nightmare. And it's only getting started. Australia spent most of the Cold War doing what Australians do best, assuming someone else would handle the dangerous stuff. The Americans would handle the Soviets. Britain covered the rear. Canberra's contribution to regional security was cricket, Foster's, and the occasional shouting match with the cassowary. That arrangement worked fine until it didn't. China's military buildup across the 2000s started sending signals that the old logic, "we're far away, nobody cares, she'll be right," was becoming dangerously complacent. Then came 2020. China slapped trade sanctions on Australian barley, wine, beef, and coal in an apparent attempt to punish Canberra for daring to call for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. The Australian response was essentially noted, and they started spending on exactly the kind of military architecture Beijing had spent a decade assuming Australia would never build. The 2023 Defense Strategic Review was the first real admission that Australia faced a threat environment it had never planned for. The 2026 version, published in April this year, dropped all diplomatic softening and committed 425 billion Australian dollars across the decade. That is not a typo, to rebuild the Australian Defence Force into something that could actually complicate a Chinese military campaign in the Indo-Pacific. The Air Force is where the transformation is most immediately visible. The F-35A is now Australia's core combat jet, replacing the legacy Hornet fleet. The RAAF operates it with real proficiency. These are not museum pieces bought for the photo op. They're integrated into the same targeting networks that American and British pilots use, which matters enormously when you understand that modern air warfare is less about individual aircraft and more about which network sees the target first and shares that data fastest. Australia's F-35s can talk to American satellites, British carriers, and Japanese fighters in real time. That is not a medium-power air force. That is the Western anchor of a very large kill chain. On the ground, the Army is taking delivery of 75 upgraded M1A2 Abrams tanks, 211 Boxer reconnaissance vehicles, and 30 self-propelled howitzers. A genuine combined arms force, not a token. More importantly, it already has HIMARS rocket launchers in service, with a funded 2nd Regiment on the way. that 2nd Regiment, based in South Australia, is designed to hit targets 500 kilometers away, using the Precision Strike missile. Future upgrades push that past 1,000 kilometers. At that range, Australia isn't defending its own soil anymore. It's threatening yours. A Chinese planner looking at all of that is not staring at a medium-sized country with delusions. He's staring at a target acquisition problem he cannot solve cheaply. Australia fired a Tomahawk cruise missile from HIMARS Brisbane in 2024. Only the United States and the United Kingdom had ever done that before. HIMARS Sydney had already fired the Naval Strike Missile and the Standard Missile 6 in Australian firsts earlier that year. 3 new capabilities on 3 destroyers in 1 year. Vice Admiral Mark Hammond, the man who oversaw all 3, said he was incredibly proud of the sailors who pulled it off. He didn't sound like someone running a ceremonial navy. The Royal Australian Navy spent decades with one job: follow the Americans around and try not to run aground on anything visible from shore. That era is over. The Hobart-class air warfare destroyers are being loaded with more than 200 Tomahawk Block 4 and 5 missiles, eventually to be shared with the Virginia-class submarines Australia will receive under AUKUS, and almost certainly the future Hunter-class frigates as well. The Navy has up to 17 billion Australian dollars committed across the decade to Tomahawk and Naval Strike Missile acquisition combined. These are not defensive weapons. A Tomahawk has a range of over 1,600 kilometers. Launched from a submarine somewhere in the South China Sea, it reaches Beijing's naval installations without the submarine ever being detected. Then there are the frigates. In April 2026, weeks ago, Australia signed a $7 billion contract with Japan and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries for the first 3 of 11 new general-purpose frigates under Project C-3000. Japan's upgraded Mogami class, which only entered Japanese service in 2022, will be the first of these, delivered from Japan by 2029, with the remaining 8 built domestically at Austell Shipyard in Western Australia. Each frigate carries a 32-cell vertical launch system, surface-to-air missiles, anti-ship missiles, and a range of 10,000 nautical miles. Australia is committing up to 20 billion Australian dollars to the frigate program alone across the decade. The RAN's surface fleet is being more than doubled. All of that is before the submarines. AUKUS is the kind of program that makes Australian defense officials simultaneously very proud and very pale. The Australian government's relationship with large numbers is historically fraught. These are people who once held a national debate about whether a coin should feature a platypus or a kangaroo and ended up with both, but 96 billion Australian dollars appears to be surviving political scrutiny. The deal signed between Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom in 2021 commits Canberra to acquiring nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarines. Not nuclear weapons, nuclear propulsion. The difference from Australia's aging diesel Collins class is not incremental. It is categorical. A nuclear boat doesn't surface. It doesn't need to. It simply disappears into the ocean and reappears where the problem is. The cost is staggering. Australia's 2026 Integrated Investment Program now puts the nuclear submarine commitment at between 71 billion Australian dollars and 96 billion Australian dollars, up significantly from the 2024 figure. Virginia-class boats, purchased directly from the United States, arrive starting in 2032. The purpose-built SSN AUKUS boats, designed jointly with the UK, follow in the early 2040s. In February 2026 alone, Australia announced 310 million Australian dollars in long-lead item spending to begin work on the first 2 SSN AUKUS hulls. Then, 3 days before this script went to record, the pathway was revised again. At the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, Defense Minister Marles Hegseth and UK Defense Secretary Healey announced that all 3 Virginia-class transfers will now come from in-service US Navy hulls. No new build included. Canberra says it simplifies supply chain management and cuts cost. Critics note that older hulls mean less reactor life remaining before the SSN AUKUS transition kicks in. The Chinese government's response to AUKUS has been consistent and emphatic. They hate it. Beijing has repeatedly called the program evidence of a Cold War mentality, accused the 3 partners of undermining regional stability, and lodged formal protests at every milestone. China's reaction is, in a sense, the clearest possible confirmation that AUKUS is working as intended. Something genuinely unusual is happening in New South Wales. Construction is underway on a Kongsberg facility that will manufacture naval strike missiles and joint strike missiles on Australian soil, with production expected to begin in 2027. GMLRS missile manufacturing commenced in late 2025. The solid rocket motor facility is funded. Australia is building a sovereign missile industry, not buying weapons off a shelf from an ally, building the shelf itself. For a country that once considered the boomerang its most sophisticated export, this is a meaningful upgrade. For Beijing, a sovereign Australian missile industry is a specifically unwelcome development. A country that depends on imported munitions can be deterred by threatening its supply chain. A country building its own cannot. Here is where the picture becomes genuinely dangerous for Beijing's planners, because it is not just about what Australia has. It is about the network Australia is locking itself into. In April and May 2026, Balikatan exercises ran across the Philippines and the South China Sea. More than 17,000 troops participated. Americans, Filipinos, Japanese, Australians, Canadians, French, British, and New Zealanders. Japan sent 1,400 combat troops to Philippine soil for the first time since World War II. A Japanese Type 88 surface-to-ship missile system fired live rounds. An American Typhoon launcher fired a Tomahawk cruise missile operationally for the first time since the system was deployed to the Philippines 2 years ago. Australia contributed around 400 personnel, working alongside every other ally in the network. China condemned Japan's missile firing as the first offensive weapons used by Japanese forces overseas in 8 decades. The condemnation was predictable. What it revealed was that Beijing is genuinely rattled by the pace at which this coalition is integrating. Australia is now buying Japanese-built frigates. Japanese combat troops are exercising alongside Australian personnel in the Philippines. In April 2026, when Defense Minister Marley signed the Mogami frigate contract with his Japanese counterpart aboard a Mogami-class warship, they called the document the Mogami Memorandum. It is a quiet but deliberate signal. The Australia-Japan security relationship has moved from diplomatic talking point to signed contract and deployed troops. For China, the geometry of this is uncomfortable. Australia built this network while officially insisting it wasn't building anything threatening, which is exactly what an Australian would say right before the thing became very threatening. Japan anchors the north, Australia anchors the south. The United States sits in the middle. The Philippines, once a country Beijing believed it could peel away from American influence, is now hosting live missile exercises targeting Chinese-claimed waters. The defense establishment calls it a vulnerability window. Australia's military transformation is real. It is also incomplete, and anyone selling you a version where Canberra already has China deterred is not being straight with you. The submarine gap is the most serious vulnerability. The Collins-class boats, already aging, will need replacement by the early 2030s. The Virginia-class submarines under AUKUS don't arrive until 2032. The purpose-built SSN AUKUS boats come in the 2040s. That is a decade-long window where Australia's undersea capability is thinner than its strategic ambitions require. ASPE's analysts have warned explicitly that the country cannot solve a 2027 deterrence problem with 2032 submarines, and they are correct. The unconventional deterrence measures being developed, long-range missiles, uncrewed systems, coalition positioning, are supposed to bridge that gap. Whether they bridge it fully is an open question. The guided weapons stockpile is also thinner than the rhetoric suggests. Australia has fired Tomahawks, NSMs, and SM-6 in trials. It is acquiring these systems in meaningful numbers, but the domestic production capacity that would sustain a prolonged conflict is still coming online. The NSMJSM factory doesn't start output until 2027. In 2026, if a conflict erupted today, Australia's missile inventory would be consumed faster than it could be replaced. None of that changes what Beijing is now facing. China's military planners do not fear Australia as a peer competitor. The plan has more ships, more aircraft, more personnel, and a larger economy behind all of it. What China does fear is exactly what is being built: a layered, integrated, geographically distributed coalition that makes any major coercive move expensive in ways that cannot be easily calculated in advance. The deterrence math is not about Australia alone. It never was. It's about whether Beijing can calculate a cost ceiling on a conflict that now involves Tomahawks launched from Philippine soil, nuclear submarines approaching from the south, and a frigate fleet built jointly with Japan. That calculation does not close cleanly. Australia spent a generation being insufficient. The country that once mismanaged a confrontation with flightless birds is now spending 425 billion Australian dollars to make sure its military ambiguity is no longer exploitable. Beijing noticed. The formal protests, the denunciations of AUKUS, the fury over every missile fired in the Philippines, that is a country watching a door it thought was open quietly swing shut. My read on this is that Australia has made the correct strategic call and made it roughly a decade later than it should have. The AUKUS investment is sound. The frigate program is sound. The missile industry build-out is genuinely smart and will pay dividends in deterrence credibility that no amount of press releases can substitute for. The concerning element is the gap between intent and timeline. The window between now and 2032 is the period where Australia is most exposed, and it is relying heavily on American extended deterrence and coalition presence to cover it. Given the current environment, a United States that is more transactional about alliance obligations than it was 5 years ago, a Pentagon actively reviewing AUKUS commitments, betting entirely on American coverage during that window is the one part of this plan that keeps Canberra's defense planners awake. What gives me some confidence is that Australia has clearly internalized the lesson. The missile factory, the Japan deal, the second HIMARS regiment, taken individually, each looks like a procurement decision. Taken together, they describe a country that has stopped trusting that someone else will handle it. If you found this useful, the channel produces this kind of strategic analysis on a consistent schedule. Hit subscribe and you will not miss the next one. The Emu War was a humiliation. This is not.